Welcome back, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Session 2, Implementation and Policy. Our moderator for this session is Joseph E. Aldy, the Teresa John Hines Professor of the Practice, Environmental Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And he will, in the interest of time, you can have all the full bios on our Radcliffe website. But I want to introduce Joe. Thank you for taking our speakers through what will be another interesting session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mac. Thanks to everyone for joining us both here in person and online. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate this conversation. Now, we know that with the rising risk associated with the changing climate, we're seeing more and more attention from policymakers, from businesses, from civil society, and from academia on strategies to address the climate crisis. We've seen the Biden administration set goals to halve emissions by 2030 and to achieve net zero across the country by 2050. Likewise, here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we have a net zero by 2050 goal. But the real challenge is not in setting these ambitious goals, it's crafting a set of policies, it's crafting a set of strategies, it's thinking through who are the key implementers of these policies, both in government, as well as in the private sector and even the nonprofit sector, who will implement this and drive the necessary change in decarbonization to deliver on these goals. Now, it's tough because both the technologies are changing rapidly and the policies are changing rapidly. And so I'm thrilled to have with us today 3 experts to help us think through this rapidly evolving policy and technological landscape, to think through how we can most effectively decarbonize our economy. First, I have Elizabeth Mahoney, who is the Commissioner of the Department of Energy Resources here in Massachusetts, Heather Tackle, the President and CEO of Power Options, and Gabrielle Wong-Perotti, Assistant Professor of Earth System Science at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability at Stanford University. So I'm going to open the session with a series of hardball questions for our panelists. We'll have a bit of back and forth among us, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Now, I encourage you, whether you're in the room or online, to submit your questions at any time during the session. I will save time to make sure we can get through as many of them as possible, but to submit your questions via Slido. You can submit those through the chat on the Zoom webinar, and I believe we have access, yes. You can, if you're in the room, use the QR code to access Slido and submit your questions to you there. We will then wrap at 12:25, where I'll turn it back over to Mac for some closing comments before we go to lunch. But let's jump right into it. When we think about the need to decarbonize the economy, it really starts with how do we think about new, more effective public policy. So Elizabeth, I want to start with you first to help us think through all the key players. How do we think about the public, the lawmakers, the stakeholders, who are all calling for more clean energy, calling for how we can advance efforts to decarbonize transportation and buildings, how to do this in what is a complicated energy system, with all the kind of networks that characterize the way we produce and consume energy. How do we think about the necessary policy tools that are going to help drive this decarbonization and help us transition to a cleaner energy economy?
Great. Well, thanks, Joe, and thanks everyone for being here in person and online. It was lovely to just take a short train ride across the river and come to Cambridge for a couple of hours, especially with this beautiful weather. But don't be fooled. We are in a time of great upheaval in our weather system, so we need to prepare for that. And I think that's where a lot of the conversation probably stems from in that we're having today, and the impacts of climate change, both on how we prepare for coming storms, but also the reckoning that we have to face in terms of transitioning our clean energy, our energy systems to a clean energy and decarbonized future. So when I think about everything that we need to work on, as Joe set it up, there's a lot there for us to dig into. We have obviously legislative directives, which is driven by the stakeholders around the Commonwealth, particularly here in Mass. We have advocacy groups, we have constituents, and just everyday residents and business folks calling for change. And then the legislature takes that and runs with it. And there's no better evidence of that this week in Massachusetts. Just last night, a climate bill emerged from a conference committee. It is an unusual time for a conference committee to come out, but it just speaks to how much discussion is going on out there and how much call there is for advancements in clean energy and decarbonization efforts. So it starts with those calls for change, and then it of course transitions to statutory change, and then the work that I do at the department is we have to regulate that. We have to actually turn that into policy and take what the legislature has directed us to do and start working with developers, start working with our utilities to implement the ideas that are out there. And that's where the rubber hits the road, but it's also where the challenges really start to kick up, trying to address everybody's hopes and dreams and actually effectuate change. I think there's a lot to think about, but like I said, we focus on the statute, we focus on regulations. Certainly coming out of the IRA and bill, we are looking at tax policies and how do we implement that here. And at the heart of it, how do we bring together all of these hopes in effective policy? And I think we'll talk a lot about that, really building out our grid, making sure that there is clean energy that is available, solar, storage, offshore wind, and making sure that consumers have access to it all. Not easy, but certainly a lot of creative minds puzzling through it.
Great, thanks. So when we talk about the rubber hitting the road, the challenge, of course, is going from the policies, whether it's regulations, providing subsidies, whether it's through rebates or the tax code. What we're trying to do is drive changes in behavior by households and businesses throughout the energy economy. And at Power Options, Heather, that's what you really focus on, is how to work with the customer. So help us better understand how, given the fast-moving suite of technological options, different ways we consume energy, different ways we can even produce energy at our own buildings now in a way that we couldn't a generation ago, how do you think about that intersection of the technological change with the intersection of that technological change with the evolving policy landscape that Elizabeth talked about? How do you work with customers to help them navigate that, make the most of it, and figure out what is sort of the best fit for them that enables them to be a partner and a contributor to decarbonization?
Thank you. Yes, thank you for having me here, I should say. I really appreciate the opportunity to be at Radcliffe and engage in this conversation on the policy side. My background is a for-profit side, and now with the nonprofits. Policy is where the rubber meets the road. I said long ago when I thought about my for-profit experience and being a little bit disheartened for a variety of reasons that maybe I should go back into government. I was in the military previously, so. But because in our sector, in this world, policy are the market makers. Policymakers are the market makers, right? And that's where absolutely it starts and creates those markets that are needed until those efficiencies can come from scale. But at the heart, I am used to working with customers, and I should explain Power Options for a second. We are a nonprofit serving nonprofits with energy solutions to reduce the cost, carbon, and complexity of their energy use, importantly with the nonprofit sector, so that they can save their resources for their own important missions throughout all of our communities, right? Nonprofits being so important and also typically under-resourced. So we have some of the greatest challenges in terms of the customer types that we serve and what they're facing in terms of resources. And as a nonprofit, we do things differently a little bit in providing those solutions than a typical for-profit would. And one way we do that, interacting with policy more than I ever have in any other previous position, is by advocating on their behalf. We spend a great deal of time working with the commissioner and the other legislators, policymakers, DPU. We even sit at the wholesale markets, ISO New England, in order to advocate on their behalf. That happens to benefit probably all commercial industrial sector, but specifically for nonprofits. But then on the flip side, because we're participating in those forums, then we try to create that as education. But make it as simple as possible. I was a founder of a startup one time, and our tagline was "Energy Made Easy," which is not easy, right? And that's why complexity is in our mission statement, because it's so difficult to translate what is happening on the policy front that then allows you to to go ahead and implement. And we have to take the policy and translate that into something that they can understand, a layperson's language, but also then explain the different technologies. And in today's day and age, we have not one silver bullet, right? In carbon reduction and hitting our goals, it's going to have to be an array of solutions, and that makes it even more complex to someone that doesn't deal with energy day in and day out. So we work with them on not only some examples of implementing a solar and energy storage, and why can't I use this energy storage as backup power, because that's what battery storage is supposed to be, but you can't because you need to save it for the economic benefit of demand management, to why do I have this adder on my bill? What is this? Because we also help with them with their energy procurement, and I'm paying XYZ cents per kilowatt hour for efficiency or for soon-to-be offshore wind and all of those things that they might not implement within their own facilities, but it also needs to be part of the technological equation. So bringing all of those and trying to explain those and make it really simple. But at the end of the day, I'll say one thing that I've said for a couple of years now in my couple of decades in this sector. I haven't met more than, I will call it, I'll say 5. I think I'm up to 5 now in those years of customers who have made a decision to go forward with a climate or an energy reduction or carbon reduction project where the economics didn't make sense for them. Ultimately, it's translating policy down into economics, and when those policies are pretty complicated as energy storage is, and you have to have 5 different value streams all stacked together, it's really difficult, and we try to simplify that for them, but it stems from how simple are the policies.
Great. Gabriel, let's turn to you to help us better understand what makes a sustainable energy transition. We know that we're going to need to see change at multiple scales, whether it's decisions made by individuals, at communities, at states, national level, and hopefully if we're more effective, even coordinating with partners around the world. Behavioral science can bring some really important insights to help us understand how to make the transition work more effectively in a more equitable manner. Can you share with us a few of the insights regarding technology adoption and policy development that help us better understand this transition and how it can unfold?
Great, thanks, Joe. And I also want to build off of the comments that Elizabeth and Heather made, and they really resonated with me. So we can think at the individual level of how we may want to encourage adoption of new or emerging energy technologies or the support for those policies that can enable those technologies and rapid transformation. And one example, which I think may resonate with a lot of people, and you kind of feel this in your gut too, is leveraging social norms. So what do other people think of me? What do I think people expect of me? Those types of feelings that people have, and those can be effectively leveraged in terms of reducing energy consumption or increasing energy efficiency practices. There are a number of other things that we're learning as we kind of move along, trying to encourage a transition. So, Elizabeth, bringing up your point of the environmental disasters that we're experiencing right now, I do a lot of longitudinal panel studies where we follow cohorts of people, generally thousands of people, for example, on the US Gulf Coast, as they're impacted by these types of events. And what we have found is that those types of events increase people's sense of anxiety, and that anxiety fortunately does not turn into a mental health crisis. That can be enough to motivate people to not only take pro-environmental actions, such as interest in adopting new energy technologies, but also support for climate policies. So we're seeing these as focusing events, and we need to consider using these events potentially as ways to talk about strategies that people can adopt or strategies that people can support. Another thing that I want to mention is that audience matters, and how we communicate about low carbon or clean energy technologies can really be effective if we know something about that audience. So for example, we did this study where we were trying to promote civic engagement among parents, and we found that linking clean energy to reduction in things like respiratory illnesses, asthma, et cetera, among parents in states like Michigan, where a lot of coal-fired power plants are used, can be an effective way to leverage parent support. And in fact, parents were picking up the phone and leaving messages for energy providers in their state. And we see different messages resonating with parents in different locations. So really thinking about your audience matters. Another thing that matters, again, with these focusing events, is helping people make that link between these types of events are happening, and this is attributable to human-caused activities, like burning fossil fuels. Because if we can switch the attribution that people are making, then it's like that aha moment, right? This has something to do with climate change, and so I'm going to think about low-carbon technologies. I'm going to think about supporting climate and energy policy. So those things really matter at the individual level. There are also things that matter if we're trying to think about policy development and engaging with policymakers. With a student, we did this experiment using a polling firm that works with policymakers at the local level. And what we found is that when you elicit an evidence-based policymaker identity, it helps policymakers sort of put their partisan identities kind of to the side to be able to understand and better process information in a more balanced way about different sorts of energy portfolios in an effort to kind of support more reasoned arguments. So we can think about different strategies that both reach individuals but also policymakers as they're developing policies.
Great, thanks. Elizabeth, I want to go back to you to discuss a little bit about how do we think about this, as Heather noted, kind of complicated policy landscape. Washington, D.C.'s opened up its wallet. There are a lot of resources coming down both through the states and directly to individuals and businesses when they adopt certain kinds of technologies. We've seen some actions where that makes it sort of easier to design regulations that can be a bit more ambitious and sort of pushing, sort of complementing, if you will, the subsidies that are coming from Washington. In the state government, how are you thinking about that kind of interplay of what's coming from Washington in terms of those subsidies and the kinds of regulations you're promoting, whether it's to promote alternative energies or offshore wind or other technological adoption here in the Commonwealth?
Well, first of all, I think for those of you who know Governor Healy from Massachusetts, you know that she was a basketball star here at Harvard, and that hunger for winning has not gone away. So we have a directive to apply for everything. So we've been, and we're doing pretty well in going after money from these terrific and really market-changing bills, IRA and bill. But once we get the money, then to your point, Joe, we have to weave it into the programs that we've already led on in the Northeast region, and quite frankly in California and New York, and we're the states that are leading on all of these issues. So we had a really good basis here in Massachusetts to go after these funds, but then we had to think about, well, how do we add to what we're already doing? There's all sorts of terms that they've used coming out of this: braiding, layering, stacking, what have you. But it's really just, it's weaving together all of the work that we've already undertaken. So I'll give you one example, and it's because I can brag. We went after some funds from the EPA under the CPRG fund, which I shouldn't have brought up the letters, but it's a climate pollution reduction grant fund. Woo. We went after that for what was called Solar for All. Every state went after it, and in fact, it was such a popular program that they, midway through the application process, they reduced how much we could even ask for. But Massachusetts was very successful. We got the largest award in all of New England. So we have $156 million coming into Massachusetts to help us build out more solar, but bring it to low and moderate income customers. Now, at the same time, we have a terrific solar program in Massachusetts called SMART. It's an incentive-based program that helps consumers get solar either on their homes or participate in what is called community shared solar projects, where the solar panels are far away, they can buy a piece of it, and it helps reduce their, hopefully helps reduce their utility costs. So what we're trying to do now is bring together that SMART program, which is right now under programmatic review. We need to update it. It needs to reflect the changes that have come post the pandemic, post the Ukrainian war, post steel prices going up. So we're changing that, and as we change it, we are looking at this Solar for All gift that we have, $156 million, and how do we bring them together? How do we make sure that our state incentives are rich enough and complex enough to bring in and deliver the results that the EPA is looking for us, so that we can actually deliver solar projects to low and moderate income houses. So it helped us shift our thinking a little bit, quite frankly. There's a lot of pressure on Buy America, there's a lot of pressure on using union labor, and that is helping us shift what we do and how we do it, and quite frankly, focusing on Justice 40 communities, which is what the federal government refers to low or moderate income communities. In Massachusetts, we often talk about environmental justice communities. It's helping us shift our focus and deliver into communities that have been left behind too often, and we're going to do it next year.
Great. Heather, let's talk about this suite of policies, this sort of complicated policy landscape. Because while it does create more opportunities, there's more resources coming in, but there's also more standards coming into play. It is, as you know at the beginning, a bit of a challenge for the customer to navigate. So for example, here in Massachusetts, we have both a clean heat standard, an alternative portfolio standard. As you're engaging your customers and helping them navigate those standards and the fact that there may be some federal tax credits or grant programs that overlay them, how do you sort of maximize what they can realize from this, how they can decarbonize? How do we think about sort of making it more efficient and easier to take advantage and to take advantage of both the subsidies and comply with the various regulations?
We think about it a lot, and constantly now, of course, with the passing of those two acts a couple of years ago, and we're just now starting to see the money flow. Financial braiding is the term that we use as well at the customer level, right? And trying to optimize. We have a whole service offering that we call Project Navigator to navigate the amass of incentives. And in the space, I've done this for decades, but now it's even more complicated between local, sometimes it is local, BERDO, Boston ordinances, local city ordinances, the utilities, the state, the federal, and then probably an array of other extra money that's coming in and out. And it's quite difficult, even for us to stay on top of. Very appreciative, of course, of what was able to be passed at the federal level and the tremendous amount of, some say, tsunami of dollars. But the expectations almost were published so high because the reality is it does need to go to be more equitable. And these customers are sitting around thinking, well, oh, great, now the economics are going to be just turned into my favor, right? Where am I going to get money? And we do the numbers and they're not in the right community. Oh, by the way, I was just speaking to a member, a nonprofit today, who's quite upset because they did qualify in May, and then June, the numbers of unemployment in that county changed, and now they don't. And so even just keeping up with it on our side, of course, is very, very complicated. And thankfully, we have AI now that we're starting to even, try to pull in and make it easier. But that's the complication. I do not envy the policymakers. It is, I know, a difficult job. But by trying to accomplish the goals that they need to, and again, the array of different resources that we need, it becomes harder to navigate. And incentive navigation, though, has always been part of the space. That's why it's a policymaker makes the markets, because we are incentive driven. We are, we like to say we are now at par, at parity with the cost. But the reality is at the customer level, behind the meter, in the facilities, that's just not the case without incentives. So it's the reality what we have to live with. But we have some very complex spreadsheets and databases, and it changes constantly. Staying up with them is very difficult and honestly pretty disappointing to most of them. And I said it to Senator Markey a couple of years ago, and at risk, right? Because again, we're appreciative of the work that it took to pass. But when you look at it at an individual customer level and what came out of IRA, and the ITC changes, they added almost more cost back than they gave in additional credit. Unless you can maybe get your hands on that additional 20% adder through a competitive process that was way oversubscribed and again, to the communities that need to be brought forward and that have been left behind before. And so the reality, the picture hasn't really changed for most individual customers today. I wish they would have moved 15 years ago when they could have got 25% discount in the old SREC programs and the solar programs of yesteryear. But it's a lot to stay on top of. We're doing our best. I think a lot of actors, of speaking to Climate Chief Hoffer last night, talking about rewiring America, doing it on the residential level. We're also doing the same kind of thing, and doing that picture of trying to optimize your project portfolio and capital planning for projects and decarbonization in the plan that we help them create of decarbonizing over time. Which ones do you pick off first by doing that very complicated analysis of layering in all the different incentives by zip code, by project size, by facility type, by technology type. So did I make it sound complicated yet?
I think you got the point across, yes. So
Would it
Gabrielle,
actually
you don't
be
jump in here.
okay if I just expanded on that a little bit, because it just got me thinking about some of the work that I do in frontline communities, which are those communities that are impacted the first and worst by climate impacts. We work a lot with local nonprofits that may have a staff of 5 people, and so they're trying. Yeah, exactly. So they're trying to access these dollars, for example, so they can purchase heat pumps for their clients, and the requirements for just paperwork, for example, is a huge disincentive. If they're getting just meager dollars here and there, they're spread so thin, they just don't have the capacity to even access the funds, even if they're aware of them and want them. So I'm just, that's really resonating with me.
I was just complaining to the commissioner this morning. And I say sorry, got the ear of the commissioner. So, as a landlord who has properties that, would try to electrify and hopefully benefiting some of them potentially low income and where those resources need to get, we have not solved that in 30 years of energy efficiency, let alone electrification. And it's still, I've been doing this for 2 decades and I can't understand it and how to navigate the system.
Yeah.
But behavioral science will fix that, right?
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about how we could take some of the behavioral science, Gabrielle, to exploit the variation across towns and cities and states and what they're doing, where there are these opportunities. As you noticed earlier, there are these kind of focusing events that makes our efforts to deal with climate change a bit more salient. There are these opportunities to learn. And we know that if we're going to be effective in the long term, we're needing to scale up some of the most successful practices that may be occurring either among nonprofits or at the state or local level. How can research, how can the Academy help us better understand where there are those successes and where there may be opportunities for amplifying them or scaling them up in other communities?
I mean, this is a real challenge of generalizability, right? So we tend to have clusters or single case studies of what has been effective, and then we maybe even make the assumption that what was effective in one region or one location is going to be effective in another. I suppose I'm going to just sound like an academic. What is needed is more research, of course. Call me to basically understand what that minimum threshold is for those findings to scale and to scale effectively. And so I think that's actually really on the cutting edge or the bleeding edge of what is needed. How do we scale? How do we scale both in the global north, but then maybe even more importantly, if we think about low and middle income countries, what might be effective in regions where we're seeing a lot of impacts, but then also a lot of opportunity for adoption of new technologies.
So I think, Heather and Gabrielle, I want to go back to you, because this is really a question then for you, an opportunity for you to ask Elizabeth for help.
I feel bamboozled.
Heather, I'll start with you, and then I'd like to go to Gabrielle for her thoughts on this. But what strategies would you recommend for stakeholders engaging our policymakers so that we can be more effective at driving decarbonization?
Well, hopefully by stakeholders, you don't mean customers, because they're too busy and they don't understand. And that's the challenge. We want to do that kind of engagement as policymakers. I think that's the right question and try to do. But it's a lot to ask of folks who have day jobs, challenges of working life, under-resourced nonprofits and such. So unfortunately, that's not a great answer, but it's probably much like marketing, right? And doing focus groups and getting down into, probably paid affairs to be able to compensate them for their time and information, but diving to that level of detail. And I think, again, what I think you would find is that they don't have more than 5 minutes. There's some quote around research around this, right? 5 minutes to think about their energy bill, and let alone their plans for their heating and cooling systems for their facilities in an average organization and institution that's not larger than, say, 100 people for a business or something like that. So they don't have the time, but marketers in the corporate world, right, have figured out how to get that research and information from them. So I think it's got to be a proactive, more than just, I think these days we talk a lot about stakeholder engagement, and it becomes these public forums and make sure they're in multiple language. I really appreciate the efforts, but I'm not sure the channels are the right ones and the ways to get to the decision makers ultimately who have to, and this is of course for behind the meter solutions, right? There's also the front of the meter, large scale renewable resources, and how does that impact bills and the energy and affordability that we're dealing with, especially for low income ratepayers, and putting everything on the electric bill at cross purposes with what we're trying to do for electrify. But yeah, I think it just takes the knowledge and working with them through, all I can think of with the marketing background a little bit is focus groups, but then also some really creative, out-of-the-box thinking. I was mentioning to Elizabeth this morning, I said, maybe, no offense, maybe we need, I'm this kind of person, we need to blow it up. And instead of 20 different policies, this would never work, right, in reality. But maybe we don't have an APS, a clean heat standard, a clean peak standard, what am I missing? Existing RPS, CPES. Maybe it's just one huge catch-all bucket. And then we would stop worrying about bean counting. And this is a legislative problem, and again, out of the policymakers' control to a large degree. But a lot of you just look at the Massachusetts efficiency programs, and trying to move to electrification has been challenged because we're still stuck with 2010 legislation that says we have to do everything on a cost-benefit analysis, and that doesn't work when even when you put in the societal costs. It's just we haven't gotten there. And we make it so complicated for the customer, the facility owners, the fleet owners, because we have to do that bean counting. When the reality is we can do some great academic analysis of, generally speaking, what do we think it's going to cost, what's the right incentive towards that to get to what amount of greenhouse gas savings, 1 million heat pumps, average of X dollars, and just mass scale implement that, rather than a 4-month process that requires tenant bills and all of these obstacles and bean counting that has to happen because we're stuck in this 2010 legislation. So maybe it went beyond the how to reach the stakeholders, but it's really has to be, I think, out of the box thinking, which is difficult for any system to do.
Gabrielle.
Oh my goodness. And again, putting you maybe on the spot, Elizabeth, I'd love to know what you think we should be doing, but I can say what some of the things that we've been doing to try to catch attention. So I think one thing that we need actually is more information. So just as an example, and this has to do with some of the air quality work that we've been doing with tribes and also with frontline communities in the San Francisco Bay Area. How many of you have heard of a low-cost air quality sensor called Purple Air? Okay.
A few hands up here.
A few hands. So people have heard this. It's a low-cost device which tells you about your PM, your humidity, your indoor air temperature, et cetera. And when we look at where these devices are located, they tend to be located in more affluent regions, right? And so when we look at a map and you overlay that with socio-demographic data, we see that they're basically these white spaces where we have no data, we have no information, and the communities I work in, that corresponds almost exactly. So we have outfitted with our community partners homes with these devices, and this is important for the NGOs that we work with because it provides them with the information they need to then advocate on behalf of their clients. And so that type of information can be helpful and hopefully is a low ask of the households, because you're totally right. People are already burdened. They don't have time to show up. If they do, I mean, some of the communities work in, people working are 2 or 3 jobs. They may be undocumented and don't feel comfortable sharing their voice. So it's a lot to ask of people, definitely. But I think that there are strategies that we can employ to help amplify those voices. Other strategies that colleagues of mine at Stanford have used, for example, is the deliberative polling platform, which is a forum for the public to share their views and to not necessarily reach consensus, but to have a conversation about difficult topics, including energy policy. And I'm not sure then how that information can get to policymakers or legislators. But we have been told that testifying or writing policy forum pieces or writing pieces for practitioners at the right scale. So maybe focusing on the state may not be the right scale, but actually your local municipality may have more leverage there in getting change that's needed.
So Elizabeth, to be fair, the department doesn't work all the time behind closed doors. You are active, engaging a lot of the key stakeholders when you are developing policy, you're figuring out how to implement what comes out of the State House. So help us understand a little bit about that, and especially where you see there being sort of innovation in the process of engagement in recent years that enables us to have more voice from the public and stakeholders in your policy actions.
Yeah, I could give you 2 really strong examples, but since we're in Cambridge, I'll stick with one about a substation that's going to be built here in Cambridge. So I think that, correct, the DOER is constantly engaging with stakeholders. We collect public comments, written and verbal. We are trying to expand how we do that and making sure that we are providing access to everyone in the Commonwealth so that they can speak in their voice and their language, and we hear them clearly. So we are trying to expand that engagement. We are also trying to do it in a way that it actually is influential on the policy. And in the past, maybe you would draft a regulation, and then under our statute, Chapter 30A, you publish it with the Secretary of the Commonwealth. You have a public comment period within like 90 days, you get written comments, and then you go through it. Well, that's not as effective. That's us having made decisions and then people reacting to it. And so what we are trying to do, and I think Chief Hoffer probably would have gotten to this last night, that this is what we're trying to do across the administration, is really engage with communities, with stakeholders, with developers, with customers early and often, so that we can really understand what the needs are. And so, one great example is in Massachusetts, everywhere, we're going to have to upgrade our electric grid to do everything that we're talking about. Solar, batteries, electric cars, heat pumps. Our grid is not ready and isn't ready for what we're going to put on it in 2035. So we're starting to build it out, and we're starting to think through it. And I think that there's a lot of ways that technology and data can help us plan for that better. But in the meantime, we've got to start building some substations. And there was a very public and difficult situation in East Boston where a substation was proposed, and there were a variety of stakeholders that had differing opinions on where it should go. And so it ultimately was agreed to be sited in this one location that the community really was very frustrated as to where it was sited. So that was a project sponsored by Eversource. Eversource is also the electric company here in Cambridge. So then they had to site a substation here in Cambridge, and they took a lot of hits in that siting in East Boston, and they've learned from it, thankfully. So when they shifted their focus to Cambridge, they really started working with the community and talking to them. How can we do this better? Where do you want this substation? what are our alternatives? And ultimately what happened is they found that there was lo and behold, a developer about to build a very large office, I think it's mixed-use building in Kendall Square. And they worked with the developer to site the substation under the building. And so it's great because the building's going to need more power. They're going to have to rely on that substation. The community really liked the siting of it because it's out of sight, out of mind. And it really was driven by those early discussions and the lessons learned from East Boston. So I think that's where we are really trying to focus, is how at DOER can we engage in a meaningful way so that we're hearing early what we should be doing, we're having these honest discussions, and we're incorporating those suggestions into our policy development.
My colleague over in the government department, Steve Ansel-Bahar, has talked about the kind of challenge we face with trying to accelerate clean energy in America, because we have a number of processes that are really intended to sort of slow down development that date back to the early 1970s. And part of that was a reaction to rapid economic development that was occurring irrespective of the impact on local communities or the environment. And so now we have this challenge sometimes where we may be doing something that is, we think, good for the environment, and a special interest takes advantage of one of these existing processes or laws to try to slow it down. So as we're trying to accelerate clean energy development, we're trying to build out a modern grid. We know we need to upgrade both distribution and transmission. It's hard to actually site, especially transmission, to get clean energy from where it's produced to where people consume it. How can we be smarter and more effective in accelerating clean energy development while at the same time ensuring that the people who are affected by this have voice in that process? Elizabeth, I'll start with you, but I suspect there may be an array of opinions on the panel.
I'll start by saying everyone is about to be impacted by this. It does not matter where you are, or if you're rural, if you're in an environmental justice community, if you're in the loveliest neighborhood in Metro West. You all are going to have to deal with siting and permitting, either for new clean energy, or if you want to have 3 electric vehicles in your house and electrify your building, you are having an impact on the grid, and so are your neighbors. So it's going to be everywhere. So I think, number one, we need to start having very honest discussions about that and start really gathering information and opinions from everyone. I'll say also, so this climate bill that came out last night, it included a lot of the language that came out of a Governor Healy-led organized discussion on siting and permitting. So there is going to be siting and permitting reform in Massachusetts. It's an innovative way of thinking about it, still making sure that our municipalities have a good, strong voice in the permitting process, but also setting standard timelines and processes for development, so that the public knows when they can engage, but the developers also know how long it's going to take. And yay me, I get to build a new division for siting and permitting at to the DOER. Unfortunately, no money was attached to that bill, so
You're going to do more with less?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. That should be our motto. I'll be panhandling later. But it's important because we're going to help the municipalities figure this out. But I think that's one thing, is we need to have a better system and a more predictable system for everyone involved. The other piece is that we need to evolve our thinking, and I'll try and stay off my soapbox, but we need to evolve our thinking and how we build out our grid. Our utilities are very used to building a system that connects a large coal plant somewhere far away to end users miles and miles away. And now we have distributed energy generation everywhere. We know that more is coming, and we need to plan better for it. So we've been inching the utilities along, but we need to sort of shake them loose and have them start planning in a way that's not reactive to what's coming before them in terms of permitting or, in their case, interconnection applications, we need to be working collectively together to say, we're going to build out the grid here in this part of the state, where we're going to build out everything there for now, and then we're going to turn to over here. We need to proactively think, and I think between siting and permitting and really getting our utilities to think in that way, we can do a lot better.
Right.
Yeah, this is less from a customer perspective, but I think a lot of our problems here in New England and maybe in other places, California as well, are driven by land as a premium, right? In these coastal areas, and it's the challenges around distributed energy generation versus utility scale generation. I was refreshing on some numbers, and Climate Chief Hoffer said it last night too. The South, these other states are beating our pants in terms of implementation. In some areas, implementation of utility scale renewable generation is one of them. They realized the economic benefits. They have land at less of a premium, and they're up to 60 gigawatts of renewable energy and 5 gigawatts of battery storage in Texas, as an example. And so they don't have, it seems like on the surface with those numbers, as big of a challenge. So when we say there's was it a 3 gigawatt opportunity for solar in Massachusetts, but then when you start to carve out all of the environmental areas and it gets down to 0, I think, was shown by New Leaf on a map. I'll have to get you that map, but it was.
I disagree with that map. We have 50 gigawatts of potential technical solar
Sorry,
potential
50
in
gigawatts.
Massachusetts.
Yeah.
I don't agree with New Leaf.
So how
Have to
get
change
there?
their business model.
It would be interesting to get your thoughts on that map, because it seems like you narrow that 50 gigawatts when you do all the land constraints of what we also value, right? The environmental benefits, the carbon sinks and such. So anyway, long story of it seems like a lot of challenges we have here, particularly around land use. But then we're also in a deregulated, disaggregated system too, and the different value streams and challenges between wholesale and retail and who gets what and how do you add them all together, because you can't, because there's now all of those value streams and ways to monetize on one bill. But last night I was speaking to a fellow from the Salata Institute, Holly, who's working on and has been previously within DOE working on community benefits. It's a word we hear a lot now. And again, I do not envy you. And how do you make sure as policymakers that the community benefits happen alongside of speed? I guess my answer is it is really hard. And I feel like it's going to triple, quadruple the cost of what it's already a very costly exercise, although only a sixth of the cost of what it will take to remediate and respond to, according to the numbers I heard from Chief Hoffer last night. So, but it's going to add cost and time, but surely transparency and a plan. I think that a consolidated plan, because we're in this disaggregated system here in New England, where electric and gas are not overlapping in some territories, and it's just all been very siloed, and we haven't had this comprehensive all of state or all of region, and now what we're thankfully starting to work towards, the states are starting to work together to come together, because it is a regional problem and we're not so not connected, that those things are starting to happen, the grid modernization plans being required and happening, and actually putting a plan in place. Hopefully, to go back to the customer, I'll have less complaints about why is it taking 3 years to get my 50 kW solar project on my roof built.
Gabrielle?
Okay. So I think we are all understanding and recognizing the urgency of this situation. We need to move quickly, and we need to scale as rapidly as we possibly can. And as Elizabeth, you rightly pointed out, I completely agree, it's going to happen to all of us. We're going to need to face this and be potentially subject to the burdens of this rapid transition that's needed. But I believe that we can do it in a way that minimizes harm. So I think one thing, when we think about community engagement, there are different flavors of engagement. One flavor is informing people you're going to do something. Another type of engagement is informing them and allowing them to respond, so consultation. Another form of engagement, which I was hearing actually, is what we call co-production. So it's actually working with affected communities, with affected stakeholders in the development of a policy, in the development of a siting decision, as an example. So co-production has actually, there's more research that needs to be done to evaluate its effectiveness, but it has been shown, at least anecdotally and qualitatively, to be an effective process. There are some things to keep in mind. Who gets to show up to the table? So not all stakeholders are able to show up to the table, and if they do, they may not all be imbued with the same level of capital or power, kind of that cultural capital, that social capital that they have to sway decision-making. And so for example, in some of the communities that we work in, where it's harder for people to show up, the community partners have employed something called a climate ambassador system. It's based on what is called the promotores model from public health, where community members go out and they talk to their friends, their families, the people in their neighborhoods to find out what's going on and then act as representatives for their communities. So I think that there are innovative ways for us to be able to more effectively engage and to raise the voices of those who may not be able to be at the table or who have not been recognized previously.
So we've been focusing primarily on ways to decarbonize, advance clean energy deployment with the goal of mitigating the emissions causing climate change. The climate is changing. We're bearing the effects today. There's a growing interest and concern about how we enhance our resilience to those risks. And especially when we think about some of the strategies in the energy system for decarbonizing, it's through more and more electrification. So how do we think about the sort of dual challenge of both reducing our emissions in the energy system, but also enhancing the resilience of the system, whether we think about it from the standpoint of an operator of the grid, whether we think about it in terms of generators, whether we think about it as households or small businesses that are consumers? How do we think about the most effective ways to manage both and deliver on both our goals for mitigating emissions and improving our resilience?
This is why when Heather says we just need to blow it all up and put it together, it feels impossible. Because there's so many, Joe, you just identified so many different parties that are involved in this. But I think the way that we've been trying to lead on this at DOER is thinking about all of those parties together, or all of the different sectors that we address together. When I started, we had a policy and planning group that was really hyper-focused on offshore wind. Then we had a renewables group that was really focused on solar. Well, now because of everything that's happening in the grid, those teams really need to work together. So it's about bringing everyone together and then utilizing everything we have before us to effectuate change. We have, as I said before, our utilities are maybe stuck back in the 1950s, but we know that with data, we know that with scientific analysis and technological advances, there's ways to address our grid right now so that we don't have to build a substation right away. And we're gonna have to build some substations, but there's a way to do things so we have to build fewer substations, build out fewer transformers. And it's about utilizing everything folks have at the house, at their business, and interacting the right way with our grid. And I think that there is a real reliability argument there. When I have to, if I'm here, I'm going to talk about building codes and that we need to weatherize our homes and we need to build the right way. And doing that means there's less impact on the grid, that those buildings are more prepared for a climate emergency or a weather emergency. And it really takes together all of the data and the technology that we have out there. But we have to sort of almost knock people's heads together to get together on this. And it's about breaking down silos, both at my department and the work that we do, and then when we take it to the public, the legislature, our DPU, it's really forcing all of those conversations together, which is difficult and continues to be difficult.
And with that comes costs, what we think a lot about, of course, for the customer side. So my hope, at least I'll say, is that we do it in a way, it has to be holistic to bring down the cost of doing both of those things. I use a line sometimes in the costs in the wholesale energy markets, we keep adding on these winter security, and we have probably, again, this is my leaning, we have 10 different markets that I'm not sure what each of them individually do anymore, just in the wholesale side, not the retail side. And they're doing that in a silo, and they say, listen, I need $1 because we need to make sure we have secure fuel for the power plants, and we need the LNG terminal online in Everett. But then the storms are the ones that are most of our reliability problem, right? And the poles and wires is what happens, as we saw, as we usually see in New England in storms. And for so many years, because again, this disaggregated energy system that we have here, everyone is asking for a separate dollar. But as a customer, I only have $1, right? And how do you want me to best use that dollar? Instead of, when you do it in those silos, what's happening, and has happened in the last 20 years, is an overbuild. And we haven't utilized the distributed energy resources as we should. We haven't done this holistic system thinking of the wholesale to retail, to distribution, to transmission, to utility scale, down to behind the meter. They've all worked in their silos, and I think it's on the record that ISO will say, well, behind the meter is really a retail problem, but that's not how Texas is handling it. That's not how CAISO is handling it in California. There are other options, and FERC is telling you to do. I'm getting a little bit more on a platform here, of course, but showed some pictures of, we built out the transmission system in New England, 900+% cost before 2020. That was before really this transition. Now that everyone knows we have to do an immense amount of investment. So before we go spend that $1 on an additional transmission line, let's start talking about the non-wires alternatives on the gas side, the non-pipes alternatives, and doing that planning holistically. And it is a lot of players, unfortunately, because of the system that we have, and bringing them all together. And who gets to require that is the most challenging thing, because ISO doesn't believe it's their job to do it. The states are starting to work together better, but maybe not all the states are in agreement. And it is very challenging to do both of those things simultaneously. Taking natural gas offline ultimately ends up becoming, the least that have the time or understanding that are the ones usually under-resourced and left behind are going to be left holding the purse to pay for that natural gas system where everyone else got off. So trying to do those two systems, and Chief Hoffer and Dr. Kate Skarnick said it last night as well, is like, that is the most difficult thing, is how do we do it? And was it your class that showed me the energy transitions and over time, and going back to the whale oil, which I still quote? Was that in your?
I believe that may have been, so I did a little bit of that, and then David Victor was the next session, I think, talking about these long-term transitions.
Yeah, and it was, what did that graph show? Usually about 100 years it takes to get off of one infrastructure, whale oil, to the next. That was my takeaway. Maybe I wasn't a great student, but that's the quote I still use, which is, each of these energy transitions has taken about 100 years, and I wish we could press the gas faster. The fact that we didn't press the gas faster, my last comment I'll say is, we've always talked about natural gas as a bridge fuel, which seemed great at the time, but now, at least in the New England dynamic, we're dealing with a lot higher cost to the customer, I think, because we didn't press that pedal faster into the renewable transition. And now that beautiful bridge fuel that we said, help us get and do that transition over time, is costing us probably more money than it would have done if we just had gone faster into the renewable transition earlier.
I agree with both Elizabeth and Heather with what you said, and really promoting this idea of systems thinking. And then in response to Melissa's point last night about thinking about climate education and making sure that people understand how these systems work is going to be really important. And I would argue that when we're thinking about systems and the complexity of this and the reliability of the grid, we also need to see how that intersects with climate impacts and intersects with human behavior. I'll just give you two examples. One is in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, we're seeing more and more households install AC in their homes, which is in response to increases in the extreme heat days that we're experiencing. So ultimately, that's a climate adaptation measure on one hand, but on the other hand, perversely, it also contributes to climate change. So we see that, and then I think helping people understand that link, and then to consider potentially other solutions that may be more climate friendly, like natural ventilation, as an example. Building codes, changing how we construct our homes and businesses could be more palatable potentially as options for people to consider. Another thing to consider, which has implications for the reliability of the grid, is how sticky people are in their place. So for example, we see these repeated exposures to landfalling hurricanes, and we've been following people for 5, 6, 7 years. They're not moving. A lot of people aren't moving, and if they are moving, they're moving to another location that has the same types of amenities that they've enjoyed. So as the grid gets more and more stressed in these regions, people aren't leaving. So that has implications for the robustness of our infrastructure and how we're thinking about the future.
So I want to encourage you that if you have questions, please use Slido to submit them. A couple of you know that I've already asked your questions, so I've already gone to the queue. Elizabeth, I want to go to you next here to talk about public-private cooperation or partnerships. So this example of working with a developer in Kendall to put a substation in the basement seems like a nice way to solve an energy and a local community problem. Maybe it was just kind of fortunate timing. There's not a lot of space in Kendall generally. So it was at a time when there was this major development going on. But do you see that as a potential model moving forward, whether it's substations or other kinds of energy investments, that we can take advantage of where development is occurring and having the state and the private sector sort of work together on these solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, there was probably a lot of lucky timing. But in actually taking advantage of the lucky timing, we're going to have a model and a test case to hopefully replicate. I know that in talking with officials in Somerville, just the next city up, that as they are talking with developers building new larger scale buildings, that they're talking to them about supporting a larger transformer in the area or supporting larger feeders more than what they would need for their building, so that it would be, since they're already making an investment, it would create some space for other community users in the future as the neighborhood starts to transition. In Framingham, we have a new network geothermal system that is interconnecting residential, low-income residential housing, a fire station, I think a school. Just another example of testing out something that hopefully we are going to replicate. We're working on it in Lawrence and Lowell too. So I do think we need to work together, and that example is the utility had to go door to door and convince people to transition their technology in their homes to adapt to this system. So we can't do it alone. And I would also say we have a very innovative economy in Massachusetts. So we should be taking advantage of not just building developers, but of course the climate tech community that we have here to try and bring it all together. And why not grow some businesses here as we make this transition and make lives better and easier for consumers.
Great. So Heather, I want to go to you next for a question about how do we think about federal policy affecting a lot of the customers you work with. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, we had some policy innovations, among others, making nonprofits functionally eligible for tax credits that in the past could only be claimed by someone who was a for-profit entity or an individual. Looking forward, we know, for example, next year there's going to be a debate about tax policy in the US Congress. I don't know what that debate's going to look like yet. We need to see what happens over the next few weeks. But we expect that there will be a tax debate. And so there's some discussion about what more in the context of that tax debate could we do to promote clean energy. So the question was originally, what would you want in a hypothetical IRA 2.0? But we're not likely to get another really big clean energy spending bill like we did in 2022, but we're likely to see some provisions in a tax bill that moves out of Congress next year that will affect clean energy investment, perhaps by some of your customers. So what would you look for that you say, hey, if we did this in federal policy, that matters to us on the ground here and what we do in Massachusetts?
Well, I think for those of us working in this space for a while, not overly reliant on the federal policy. I think, actually in times where the colors have changed at the federal, the states actually got more ambitious and we made more progress, and the states, filled and went beyond that gap. So I'm hopeful on both sides. I'll say it that way, that federal is just part of the equation and sometimes less part of the equation. As I explained before, the IRA in terms of tax credit didn't really dynamically change the direct pay or elective pay, as it's technically called, for nonprofits to access. Well, it created a whole new technical assistance program that we need to help nonprofits with and how to access that money. It's, again, complicated. I mean, I would love to see studies and research on what would be the easiest, but it's probably something like a dollars up front without a lot of paperwork, right? And that's what we'd like to see. Direct pay, I think, try to do that, is still, as government programs tend to do, became too complicated, and it's a challenge, although it's starting to take hold. And thankfully, it's being paired with now innovation in the financing world, where there's bridge loans, and of course the state climate banks and the funding that came out of the IRA, not BIL, I think, or vice versa, that came for those climate banks is also bridging that gap. But it's so many pieces put together. So what would I love is one federal policy that covers all states, that makes it simple and easy, and dollars up front. But, the world is my oyster. It would be just almost like a easy rebate. But the rebate, I mean, all of these have complications, right? The rebate, then the manufacturers and the other suppliers in the value chain then end up just marking up their price too. So that's not the right answer necessarily of rebates, because then we just see prices go proportionally to the rebate that's offered. So it's hard, but yes, I think the tax credit getting to all, if we're going to use taxes as the financing mechanism at the federal world, which it seems like that's where the majority is, would like to see it, is it starting to get to more technology agnostic, because there's a different credit for EV charging. I'm not sure there's really a great one for air source heat pumps for commercial buildings. 179D, don't get me started, is very difficult to access, and vendors are taking all of it as frosting on the cake. And so something that's just, again, kind of one source, technology agnostic, and makes it very simple. But I know, in the reality of anything incentive-driven, that's probably impossible on the policy side.
Just to add on that, actually, speaking of study, I'm working with 2 Stanford law students, and we are interviewing communities in coal country in Appalachia to find out what their experience has been like trying to access those dollars, and then looking for potential opportunities, or thinking ahead about how to design a better policy. So
yeah. And speaking of that incentive too, that's maybe another ask, is the coal adder on the tax credit has got longevity versus the usually the coal country doesn't change, or maybe no, that is the energy communities that changes with unemployment too. Yeah. So I take that back. Sorry, longevity is just the other general ask. Yeah. The ebbs and flows and trying to catch the right moment of these incentives. They're wonderful, and I recognize the need to not overpay and try to balance cost curves coming down with changing incentives reducing. But here in SMART, in Massachusetts, with the solar incentive, I say we had such a economist-created model that it ended up being reverse incentives, and people were not installing because they're like, oh, wait, now I have to wait till next year till the energy costs get higher because we had an energy drop for a year, and therefore my incentive went down, and becomes too complicated. And their line of sight to how long that will be available tends to be really short in many of the cases. So something that lasts longer than 2 years.
Right. Gabrielle, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the importance of information. We're dealing with a lot of disinformation, deliberate misinformation. There are efforts to really undermine the value and the impact of experts, such as academics. So when we think about how we are engaging with communities on these issues, how we're thinking about either leveraging existing norms or trying to shift norms. Sometimes information is really important for that. But how can we effectively counter the misinformation out there that often is coloring the climate change and clean energy debate?
That's a real challenge. There's this fun study that I like to talk about in my class about an energy efficiency program in Southern California. I think this was run through SoCal Edison, where among registered Democrats, people in response reduced their energy consumption, but in response, registered Republicans increased their energy consumption. People don't like things to be foisted upon them, especially if it kind of smells of partisanship or it's somehow threatening to their sense of self, their identity, their group. Fortunately, when we look, for example, at polling that's been done talking about climate change, we have individuals who are at the far ends of the spectrum, so those that are completely dismissive, but actually very well informed about climate change and energy issues. And then we have those who are kind of very enthusiastically, we need to do something about it. Most Americans fall in the middle. So that's probably the audience that we want to target. We're not going to get the people who are on the very extreme end, who are very well informed and very dismissive, but rather those that are in the middle. And so I think there's really some opportunity there where people may be more open, and there are strategies that we can take to reduce what we would call bias processing of information. So one approach is allowing people to affirm their beliefs and then to have a respectful dialogue about that. One is to have safe places where people can talk about their values and disagree, but then to kind of be well informed about the facts. So there are ways that we can de-bias people's processing, but we actually need to try to use them. So, yeah.
So we have about 3 minutes left. So I want to close with a final question for all three panelists. I'm old and I've been working on this issue for a while. And when I first started working on this issue in the 1990s, if we were going to have a panel to talk about the details of policy implementation, it would be a very short conversation. There wasn't much going on, and certainly nothing of consequence coming from Washington. We had a few rather nascent efforts in a few cities and a few states. And what we've had here today is really quite an informed, detailed discussion of a lot of the challenges. But what I want to hear in our closing is what makes you optimistic that in spite of some of the challenges we've identified here, we are in a very different space in trying to change the way we produce and consume energy than we were 20 and even 10 years ago. So we'll go in the same order as we did at the beginning. Elizabeth, I'd like to hear from you, especially as you're looking out from your position as commissioner of the department. What gives you optimism about our efforts to advance the clean energy transition here in Massachusetts?
I think the biggest thing that gives me hope is that it's, particularly in Massachusetts and in New England, it's expected. We're fighting on how to do it, not that we have to do it. So that is a really great starting point. It's also maybe why we're hitting some of these challenges first, because we're doing it first. But regardless of what happens outside of Massachusetts, we're digging in and we're doing it. And I'll say, tomorrow is going to be a vote on our next 3-year plan for energy efficiency, and it's a very dynamic, innovative, forward-thinking plan. And so, that's what I'm thinking about because I have it tomorrow, but it really focuses on equity. It focuses on decarbonizing buildings, focuses on giving solutions. So I think it started with an expectation that we have to do something and we have to do it better. And over the last year, we've created that. So I think we're going to see that in other sectors because in Massachusetts, we just expect it. It's what we have to do.
Okay. Heather?
It's hard. I have that climate anxiety and doing this so long that I try to remain optimistic, but it is good to pick our heads up and realize not just where we are here in New England, where we are as a country and where we are importantly as a world, and how far we have come in that whale oil curve. I think we're about a little bit further behind than I would have hoped, that we would be more 50 years in, and we're more like 20 years in, I would think, and about 20% of the way in terms of percentage of renewable generation and how much new renewable generation is coming online in these years. But what makes me also optimistic is that when you do that and you pick your head up, we have come a long way, even though it feels like day to day we're hitting our head against the wall and we're not making much progress. And as I say, in ISO New England, we move at the speed of molasses. But that is what 100 years is. It's not our generation's problem, the generation before us, the generation behind us. This is a multi-generational problem, and we're only going to be able to make it so far. And I think we are seeing the signs, the milestones, the metrics of progress. And the activists and the protesters are still coming out and helping us make sure that we stay on that path, even though they may be disruptive.
Thanks. Gabrielle?
I have 3 thoughts on this. The first is, as I mentioned before, most Americans think climate change is happening. And as Elizabeth mentioned, it's not a question of, is it happening, but what do we do about it? How do we go about addressing it? So that's where the devil's in the details. The second point is that I work with a lot of young people, and so they offer inspiration to me every single day. They're very upset about it, but they're very motivated to do something. And that's very inspiring, and that keeps me kind of balanced. And the third thing is that I think we need to keep in mind that messages of doom and gloom can make people feel more anxious and perhaps even immobilized and may inhibit action, but messages of hope are very effective. And so making sure that we're tying in those messages of hope with actions people can take by themselves, collectively, and as a society and a nation, I think can really mobilize change more quickly.
Great. Please join me in thanking Elizabeth, Heather, and Gabrielle for their insights today.
Thank you, Joe, for leading a really wonderful session, very enlightening. And if I may ride your wave of optimism, we've been told that there is policy in place and additional policy. Implementation is always an issue, but we have, how do we incentivize the end users, our consumers, but we have behavioral scientists who are providing the data on how to do that. And with that, I'd like to announce that lunch is imminent. So I'd like to tell everyone here in Knaufel Center, we will offer free box lunches. They're available at the Fay House, which is one building to the left. And I encourage all the attendees to please take your box lunches and visit the student poster sessions. They work really hard and they're very creative and they want to share all their great ideas. I would also like to thank the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability at Harvard for their co-sponsorship of the poster session. And for everyone on Zoom and for everyone in the audience, we'll be back here promptly at 1:30. Thank you and have a great lunch.